This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda, our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Joseph Bharat Cornell. He is an internationally renowned author and founder of Sharing Nature Worldwide, one of the planet's most widely respected nature awareness programs. His first book was Sharing Nature with Children, and his current book, Deep Nature Play. Bharat, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Bharat, perhaps we can begin at the beginning of your work with using nature as an educational means, and especially with children. This goes back nearly 40 years, as I understand it. How did you get into this kind of work? What was your background at the time?
Well, I always had a love for nature, and I spent a lot of time as a child in nature. When I was 10, before the jogging craze, I would run to greet the sun, and I would just run in the Feather River, along the Feather River, and sometimes through marshes, and to greet the sun. And I always had that kind of love. And then in university, at Chico State University, I was an international relations major because that was during the time of the Vietnam War, and like many of the people of my generation, we wanted to work for world peace. And then I realized, and I was an international relations major, and I just realized that self-interest was not going to make it easy. And I had this experience along the Chico Creek that went through campus, and I just felt this incredible stillness and radiance. And this peace just came over me that just lasted for many, many hours into the night. And I said to myself, this is a true peace that I could share with other people. This is a long-lasting peace. And so I changed my major to how to find God in nature. And so
Wait, did you say you changed your major?
Yes.
I assume that was what you called your major.
Well, it was called nature awareness, but it was also underlying that, and everybody understood it. I was the very first special major student at the university, and that's what I called it. I wanted to just wanted to learn how to become absorbed in nature and everything around me, and become one with it. And of course, I didn't know how to do it. I was just a young person, and there were no other classes on that aspect. But I took courses on American Transcendentalist writers and Eastern religion, and then we created some of our own courses that some of the professors came and attended, and so it was a start. And later on, of course, my thinking became much more mature and sophisticated in terms of the nuances of actually how to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
But that was always been my interest.
Bharat, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service selected your book, Sharing Nature with Children, I'm reading, as one of the 15 most influential books published since 1890 for connecting children and their families with nature or to nature. Uh, and it goes on to discuss a highly effective outdoor learning strategy that you have. What is that strategy? And how did you develop it?
Well, first of all, I use nature activities because they engage people. When I first started, and this is how people taught, is that it was called the walk, stop, and talk method, where you walk in nature and everybody stops, and then you talk about it from maybe 30 feet away, and then people walk on to the next thing. And I just noticed that people weren't really totally engaged, and it really didn't mean that much. So I created exercises that help people to be immersed in the experience, to lose a sense of their own individuality. They were just more in the present moment, and just but some were playful, energetic. But I noticed very quickly that there was a flow of rising sort of consciousness and awareness. And in yoga, which uh, with my tradition, I'm a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda and a student of Swami Kriyananda. And with yoga, it tries to raise the energy and uplift the consciousness. And so through my experience at Ananda Village where I live, I, you try to awaken the energy, and so I did that with certain games, and then there's a 4-step process of awakening the energy through active things or just that just absorb a person's uh, attention, and then focus attention, which is help people to be very concentrated, and that helps them to be beginning stage of receptivity, and then to offer a direct experience. And this is where you have a direct experience of nature where you're just perceiving and you aren't standing back mentally
Mm-hmm.
divorced from the observed, but you are essentially one with it because you're immersed in it. And then the 4th stage is share inspiration, where you reflect on your experience and you may try to communicate it in a different way, maybe through movement or a poem or just some kind of form where you just stay with the inspiration longer and you understand it more, the nuances of it, and it becomes more clarified the longer you work with it. But it's not an over mental concept. And what I found is, the 3rd stage is all about intuition. Paul Brunton said that a mystical experience is simply prolonged intuition. And so in these experiences, another word for intuition is calm feeling. Everybody talks about learning from the heart, but what does that really mean? Well, feeling is perceived in the heart, and when that feeling is calm, it's a pure feeling, and then it's a pure thought, and that's when we directly perceive the world around us,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not separate from that world.
Is what you just...
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, just to sum it up, this is a way of working with energy of people and uplifting the energy in a gradual way that people could relate to, and it can take people that don't have a spiritual path, but they can have a feeling of energy and of awakening consciousness, and it's through them their own experience. So they're leading it rather than you trying to push them along or
Mm-hmm.
give them a philosophy that they can't quite agree with, but they actually have a deep, profound experience. So it's a gentle way of working with people.
Is what you just described what you've been calling flow learning?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, definitely. I call it flow learning, and it's used all over the world now by many. You just have to say tens of thousands of educators, and it just really works for them.
And as I understand it, you developed it originally for use with children. Is it also used with grown-ups?
Yes, very much so. Because in fact, with children, they have a natural enthusiasm and they dive right in. But adults, they can self-censor themselves, and what it helps with adults is help them to overcome their adult conditioning and to get into the present moment.
Mm-hmm.
So you would use different exercises for adults than you would for children, although adults like to be free and get out of kind of conventional adult thinking and being.
Uh-huh.
It really works with all ages because it's an experience.
Mm-hmm.
You aren't talking about intellectual levels. You're talking about that aspect that is in all of us, no matter our age.
I wanted to ask you, Bharat, you're part of the Ananda Village, which is an intentional community. You're a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, and you mentioned you were a student of Swami Kriyananda. Your teaching in terms of nature and connecting with nature, is that something that was fully embraced by your community? And were you influenced in developing it by the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda and your direct study with Swami Kriyananda?
I before I came to Ananda, I had a lot of these thoughts, and of course, I was with them in previous incarnations, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So my thinking, even
Uh-huh.
before I came to Ananda, was really shaped by them. But it really has their teachings are so clear that it really helped me to really express in a more profound way and understand really the whole process of how you really have a profound experience. And so definitely it shaped my whole being. I meditate and offer prayers uh, and just hold my mind up, and I get inspiration and things that I had no idea of how to express, or something very subtle that I'm trying to communicate, and I receive guidance all the time from them.
Hmm. But
But
wanted to ask, did the community, collectively, or those that govern the community, did they embrace what you were teaching? Did they incorporate it into the other spiritual practices that were given to you by Paramahansa Yogananda through Swami Kriyananda?
Very nature was really Swami Kriyananda, when he watched a video of the activities in flow learning, he told me that he wished every family in America could see it.
Uh-huh.
So he was always really supportive. But we had so many techniques that it took a few years for it to be embraced in the community. It was used in our schools and our Sunday
Hmm.
school programs. But now it's used at our meditation retreat. We have doctors in India that Nanda doctors have a well-being program, and it's used by them. And so it really has been embraced by the community. And because some of the activities in my book, The Sky and Earth Touch Me, they're really directly inspired by Kriya Yoga, which Kriya is a technique for drawing the life force in deeply into the spine and raising it to the higher chakras, and it withdraws the energy inward.
Hmm.
And it's really about being in your center. And with these different activities, there's one activity called I Am the Mountain, where you stand with a person and you say, I am, and that person looks out in the scene before them, and they see something. Instead of just naming it, they try to feel that essence, that reality inside themselves, and then let their words express it. Like they might say, I would say, I am, and they might say, the sailing clouds, after actually feeling the reality of the clouds within them. And people have had real dramatic experiences,
Hmm.
and it's because they're internalizing their awareness. The intellect looks outside of the body, looks externally to you, and it uses reason and the testimony of the senses. And Yogananda ji said that reason has only discovered 1/millionth of the nature of reality, but the heart, the intuition, it looks inside. And of course, Yogananda also said that God works from the inside out. And when we have that feeling inside ourselves, as we feel the aliveness in ourselves, all of nature becomes alive,
Hmm.
because we look at it with that consciousness. And so I've had people, one through hiker of the Pacific Crest Trail, he was a school teacher, and he did this exercise, and he said, "It, I experienced in 4 minutes a sense of communion that usually took me a month in the wilderness to get." And that's a big statement to make, and everybody's hyping their own pet project. But, when you internalize your energy, that energy is concentrated. Christ said that I come to give you life more abundantly. He was talking about consolidating the life force in the deep spine, and that's when
Hmm.
you have true awareness. And so so there's different activities like that that really do reflect the yogic path,
Hmm.
and really the universal path to spirit.
Bharat, since you started this work in the late 70s, you've taken it in one form or another into a number of books, but you've also taken it around the world. What have you noticed from one culture to another with respect to how people interact with nature and how receptive they are to your work? Are there cultural differences, or do you find a certain commonality, or both?
I would say there's a commonality because sharing nature is based on personal experience, and there's activities that allow people to have that experience. And like in Greece, they said this is just the way that Plato and the great masters taught. And in Japan, this is very Zen. And in China, there was this is the way that their masters taught. And in England, they had a religious studies program. They had the five great religions, and they had an application for each one. And sharing nature was chosen for more indigenous Celtic learning. And so I found that it pretty much works universally. And there's been a couple countries that are very, very rational, and I have to choose certain activities because if they're too sort of feeling oriented, intuitive oriented, I have to sort of build up to it. And they love everything else, but they're just I'm just sort of careful what I choose with them. But universally, it's well respected. Increasingly, I mean, amazing ways. And I've done it with so many different cultures in over 30 countries. But then we've had other people going. In Southeast Asia, of course, it's very, very big, and they understand meditation and the connection. But South America is very intuitive.
Bharat, you obviously in working with nature and people connection to it, it's going to be a very different experience for somebody living in the mountainous areas of Colorado or along the west or east coast or in more remote areas than it is for people in urban areas. And much of the world lives in urban areas where they don't have tremendous exposure to natural settings, to nature. What would you recommend for those people? Yeah, so that they might have these experiences and gain spiritually from them.
Well, you don't have to have a wilderness, a city park. Uh, there's different activities that that you can do that share with people where it really gets you into the present moment. And when you're in the present moment, everything feels sacred. And even usually we see something and we remember seeing it from the past, and it's more like a kind of a category of something rather than the actual experiences. One activity that would give you an idea. Well, there's a story about a young Tibetan monk at a brain symposium, and he was trying to show how he could see things freshly. And he looked over at an imaginary flower, and he said, "Flower," first time. And then a little bit later on in the discussion, he looked over at the imaginary flower and said, "Flower," first time. And he was just showing that how you could see with pure perception without the filter that we normally have. Well, there's a activity called a camera game where you take someone and there's a human camera. They keep their eyes closed, and then you turn them towards the picture, and then they use their eyes as the shutter, and you tap their shoulder, and the eyes come open when you tap the shoulder twice, and they look at a tree or bush, and then you tap again after 3 seconds to have them close their eyes. And people, by just having them see it for 3 seconds, they're just perceiving it. They aren't thinking. And people have said they remembered the picture that they took for 5 years, 8 years afterwards. And it was a little experience of pure seeing. And what it does is it gets people they have that kind of experience and they want to cultivate that, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll adopt some practices to go into that. There's an activity where you put your hands on your lap and you look at a striking scene in front of you. It could be just still in a park where it's just not a lot of people, and you just touch your fingertip every time you notice something, and you don't count. You're just using your fingers, the sensation of your fingers to touch your thigh, and it just do it for maybe 20 or 30 fingertips, which would be twice or three times using both hands. And I was doing this along a stream when I first created the activity, and there are all kinds of people walking along. Maybe 70 walked by, and my wife and I, we were doing it, and we noticed two river otters in the stream, and nobody saw these river otters, and they stayed for a good long time, and they kind of poked their head up and looked at us. We were being so still, and I think sometimes new beginnings have blessings, and maybe give me a good story to tell. But it just helps us to just get out of our thinking mind,
Mm-hmm.
and in a simple way that a child or anyone can do. And it's a little meditation. There's all kinds of sophisticated meditation practices, but I work with a real broad sort of spectrum because I'm trying to help people, become more internalized and more
Mm-hmm.
expansive in their sense of self. And so I created these. In nature, there's no ego in nature, and there's just stillness, and we're surrounded by a world of stillness, and it really helps recall to our
Mm-hmm.
consciousness the stillness that is our true nature. And so we have this all around us. Everybody knows nature's healing,
Mm-hmm.
and but of course we have to be receptive in order to do it, and it just doesn't happen by itself. I mean, I think that's why people do extreme
Mm-hmm.
sports, because they put themselves in a situation where they have to be in the present moment, and they feel more alive than they normally do. Well, sharing nature uses more softer elements of surprise, of being put in a new perspective, of playful group interaction, meditations, immersive experiences. We have buried children in leaves, and they look up like they're looking out at the earth, and they become very still and looking through the filter of leaves and the swaying branches, and they become very, very quiet. And
Wow.
one Japanese woman said that she could just hear the insects and everything around her in the whole forest, and she'd actually, because she had a real tough home life, she was 12 years old, she felt like she wanted to commit suicide, but in that stillness, she just felt the world as being benevolent, and she started to really open up, and she started to trust life, and it just helped her to really tap into the rhythm of life, which she's a part of.
Mm.
And so these activities really help people to meet nature at your best, and you meet your own inner nature at your best, because there's a reason why the spiritual practices are a discipline, and it reins in the habitual restless mind. Well, the nature activities in an engaging way just really help focus people so that they can have
Mm-hmm.
a dynamic experience.
Bharat, in the few minutes we have left, we don't want to neglect your most recent book. Tell us about deep nature play.
Well, this really explains this very nature process, because in play theory, they've associated play with timelessness, absence of self, immersion in the present moment, and the focus of play. And people are just totally involved with play. And if we're trying to become one with nature, if you use play in nature, it's really easy to have an experience of oneness with nature. But also, it's a way of integrating your own energy and feeling a sense of wholeness because you aren't questioning yourself. You're just free of all the things that usually hold you back. And so, all the great scientists, they play, and the ones that have been the most innovative, they're working through their intuition to make these discoveries, and they
Mm-hmm.
use logic in order to explain them. And so there's adult play as well, and people say, well, when you're playing, you aren't accomplishing anything. But there's all kinds of stories about how people they got into this intuitive flow, where life, through their receptivity and lack of ego, and their higher soul, or whatever you want to call it, God, their intelligence, has spoken to them and given them incredible insights. It's because they were more deeply receptive and they were able to receive higher wisdom than just doing a mundane activity that you've already done and you're
Mm-hmm.
doing that out of habit and your mind isn't really uplifted. And so what this book does is it helps people to, it, it proposes a whole new way of learning, a superconscious form of learning where you're more intuitive, more inspired, and how you could be much, much more productive than just using an intellect that isn't inspired. When you have deep inspiration, there is more pure feeling and more pure thought, and it's more inspired, and it's more universal because it's of that inspiration.
Great. Bharat, thank you so very much for your time today. And again, the book, Deep Nature Play, now available. And any final words you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share with your audience. And I should mention that we have a wonderful website called sharingnature.com, and you can find more about
Mm-hmm.
my work and my books at that site.
And we'll have that up on the web when we post this interview. And you also have a personal site, jcornell.org.
Yes, yes.
Good. So everybody can find out more about Bharat's work and get out in nature.
And
Great.
find your inner nature. Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Thank
taking
you.
the
Thank
time,
you so
Bharat.
very much.
Good.